seat, I just want to introduce Ian Brown. So I'm unapologetically a John Boyd fan. One, he's an American theorist, which is great. You know, he's not a Brit, German. You know, he's American. Two, I love that he was about winning, how to win. And so when I first kind of became a maneuver warfare fanatic, and what's the definition of fanatic? You don't change your mind, you don't change your subject. So that's me. But anyway, you know, one of the first books I read was a new concept for war, and I was like, man, this is fantastic. Who wrote this? And I actually read it a couple times, and turned to find out it's Ian Brown. It's a fantastic book. And then he just wrote another one, and so I found him on LinkedIn. And thankfully, he accepted my friend request, so I was all happy with that day. I was like, oh, sweet, I have a friend. But anyway, with that, I want to introduce Ian Brown. And sir, thank you so much for coming.
All right, thank you, sir. Great, sir. Thank you very much, Colonel Broyles, General Sellers. I appreciate the invite to come here. I was invited last year, and I wasn't able to make it due to a work conflict, and I was really bummed about that. So I'm very glad that I have the chance to come and talk to you all live in person today. As Colonel Broyles said, I am online on LinkedIn. I'm also on virtually every other social media platform. I'm one of those terminally online people. So most of it is either Boyd, Wargaming, or New England Patriot stuff. So if that's what you're interested in, please come and find me on the platform of your choice, and I'm happy to chat and answer questions. And I'm honestly jealous, a little bit jealous that this event has been put together 2 years in a row now. It's the kind of thing I wish I'd had when I was still in uniform in the Marine Corps. We never quite got it, so I'm very happy to be here and talk to you about this. Okay, so this is nice because we can skip through this part really quick. I'm a retired Marine. What I do now is I'm a war game analyst at a defense company that still does a lot of, we do a lot of wargaming for the Marine Corps, other parts of the Joint Staff. I've written a lot of stuff, a couple of books and a lot of other articles, short stories, and I've had my fingers in some commercial game design, war game design aspects too. What I'm going to talk about today is that second book that's up there, Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals. I've got a couple copies of this, of the first book, and then a copy of my card game about maneuver warfare that I'm going to leave here for you all, as part of your PME library to use or use as doorstops as you will. Next slide. What I'm going to talk about primarily today is Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals, because this was my effort to address a shortfall in John Boyd historiography, which is he never wrote anything down. It's a common lament. You can find the slides for his presentations pretty easily online, but as I was working on my first book for how Boyd impacted the Marine Corps maneuver warfare theory, I was digging into the recorded presentations, and I found the slides do not tell the full story. At best, they tell maybe 50% of the story, and there's a lot of really interesting, good context in the back and forth that Boyd is having with the people in the audience that he's talking to that the slides don't capture. So I was like, man, I wish I'd had these recordings when I was writing that first book. So I decided I would solve that for future researchers into Boyd. I would listen to those recordings so you don't have to, because the quality's pretty lousy, honestly. But that's what this book is. This is all the transcripts of all of Boyd's recorded presentations with the slides embedded. Not only hard copy, but it's also available soft copy from Marine Corps University Press, all for free. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of like pull out from across all of those presentations, and not just the slides, but the things that he said to his audience. What are some of the salient points that touch on the theme here of fighting outnumbered and winning? All right, so before I start, usual disclaimer, these views are my own. They don't represent the views of my employer, the United States government, or any other entity with which I am affiliated. Okay, so any discussion of Boyd and the ideas of fighting outnumbered and winning, it has to start with the engine of Boyd's thought, which is one of the few things he did write, the essay Destruction and Creation, which he wrote in the late 70s, kind of shortly after he retired out of the Air Force. And I'm going to drive this home because I know Boyd is most well known for the OODA loop, but this is the engine that underlies everything he talked about. The OODA loop was kind of it was an output of these ideas. It was in many ways kind of a capstone of his many decades of looking at conflict and competition. But the engine under all of them is destruction and creation. So we're going to start here. All right, so the whole point of destruction and creation is trying to build a framework for surviving and surviving on your own terms. In order to survive, Boyd's assumption was survival requires constant decision making and then acting on those decisions based on the world and the reality around you. But the only way to make sure those decisions and those actions are in your best interest, is to have the closest, the most accurate possible perception of what is a constantly changing, a constantly chaotic and uncertain reality around you, which means you have to constantly readjust and rebuild your own perceptions. So to glom things onto this model, he took things from 3 different areas of physics and science, which, we talk about warfare and competition. You're like, what does that have to do with the second law of thermodynamics? We'll get to that point. So the first thing Boyd pulled into his framework was Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And this is the notion that you can't prove the consistency of a system from within that system. You need to step back and look outside of that system and look in to understand the totality of a system. The second thing he glommed on was Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which holds that the very presence of an observer in a system injects uncertainty and disorder into that system. And the deeper the observer pushes themselves into that system, the more changes, the more erratic behavior they see, of which they themselves are the cause. They are in the system and they are changing it by participating in that system. And then the second law of thermodynamics is that third piece, which is that all systems trend toward entropy or disorder. And if you're in a closed system, that system is going to always tend toward disorder because there's nothing new entering that system to improve its condition. So how does this all fit together into decision making? So per the incompleteness theorem, you can't understand the nature of a system within itself. You need another system. From the uncertainty principle and second law of thermodynamics, attempting to understand that system from inside without stepping back, looking around at new information, is only to cause more uncertainty and then create more disorder in that system and then push that perception of that system farther away from its actual reality. So if you're in a closed system, that's bad, right? You need, if you're making decisions within a closed system, your actions may not be matching what is required for the actual reality around you, which creates a very dangerous divergence. If you're making decisions that are untethered to reality, that's bad. And we can probably understand why that's bad, in not just in warfare, but in anything that requires a decision and action. So to counteract this, you constantly have to break down and build up the information that's around you. You have to constantly incorporate new information to keep pace with all of those changes around you. And the important point in this is that never stops, right? There's no point at which you're like, I know everything, I'm good, I don't have to read anymore, I don't have to study anymore, I don't have to learn more about what new drone systems are out there, right? Like, I'm good. You can never accept that point. You always have to be ingesting and adapting your understanding of the world to make sure that your understanding matches the world as closely as possible as it is. All right, next slide. Okay, so that's destruction and creation. It's entirely theoretical. It's a very abstract paper. The next thing Boyd did was, is there evidence in history to support this decision-making model that he came up with? So kind of the second element here of fighting outnumbered and winning, right, is Boyd looked throughout military history to try and look for evidence for that decision-making system that he had. And his presentation patterns of conflict was essentially his explanation to take that framework, look at military history, and see if there were any threads he could pull out that had a correlation with what the most successful commanders and militaries in history did. Did they use his decision-making model or not? And essentially his conclusion was, yes, the more successful commanders in military did have maybe not a explicit understanding of the system, but an implicit or inherent understanding of it. And he also found that those successful commanders, in both an understanding of the system for themselves, they were able to take that dangerous divergence and flip it around and impose it on their adversaries, so preserving their own sense of reality and accurate decision-making on the friendly side and smashing that ability on the adversary side to render their various centers of gravity, their centers of power, not as effective. And Boyd kind of defined this as a new conception for waging war. That's a quotation I pulled to use for the title of my first book. And he describes this new conception of war as, and I'm quoting him here, generate a rapidly changing environment, quick, clear observations, fast tempo, fast transient, quick kill, or you can turn it around the other way to inhibit an adversary's capacity to adapt to such an environment, suppress or distort his observation by suppressing or distorting your signatures, always try to remain somewhat inconspicuous, at least more inconspicuous than he is, Unstructure your adversary's system into a hodgepodge of confusion and disorder, thus causing him to under or overreact to your activity, which appears uncertain, ambiguous, and chaotic to him. And that's kind of a long way of describing sort of the classic maneuver warfare definition that appears in certainly Marine Corps doctrine, and as the general mentioned this morning, matches that. So Boyd would concede that this system would seem to require an almost unnatural degree of prescience and cohesion to be able to do it effectively. Are human beings capable of doing this? And he said that, yes, it is possible to execute this type of system and disrupt it in your enemy if you leverage a couple of other concepts that he spends a lot of time talking about in patterns of conflict. The first one is a concept called Fingerspitzengefühl, or fingertip feeling. This is a German term that describes a intuitive ability to look at a given situation, immediately grasp the essentials, and act. Another term for it might be the coup d'eil that Clausewitz talks about, Fingerspitzengefühl, just another German way of saying that. And he said that you can develop this fingertip feeling in your own people and in yourself by giving them constant and repeated hands-on experience under a variety of circumstances, so that they build a repertoire of responses and inculcate decision-making and action as a habit, right? It's essentially, your football playbook. You don't have one play in the playbook. You've got 50 or 100 different plays, and you constantly practice the plays, variations on the plays, so that you have this massive library of plans and responses available to you mentally to apply based on the circumstance you see on the football field or the battlefield. The second thing you need to execute this style of war, this may seem deceptively simple, but it is absolutely vital, and that is the element of trust, right? Trust can be developed in the very process of developing Fingerspitzengefühl, in the process of developing the fingertip feeling, as you're training your people to have fingertip feeling. And through that process, leaders can observe the strengths and weaknesses of individuals, of units, and their ability to do Fingerspitzengefühl. And then you can use that knowledge to better direct your individuals and your teams in ways where their individual and collective abilities better complement each other, right? Some of your platoons might be better in one area than another. You know that because you put them out there and you've watched them operate. So you know if there's, an obstacle breach, you want to maybe put this platoon in charge of that because, for whatever reason, they've proven to be very good at it. Whereas if you're doing some sort of reconnaissance, there's maybe another platoon, they've proven, that they can do it because you watched them do it. You're going to put them in the position where they can capitalize on their strengths and mitigate their weaknesses. And he said that the whole process of building this, the end result is that you get an organization that almost functions as a family, where you know each other so well, you've been through so many different circumstances, building that repository of responses that, if you're at a family dinner, right, you probably know who's going to talk politics, who's going to talk sports, who's going to drink too much. You simply know all these things because you've been among them and you've seen it. And so this creates a implicit level of communication that cuts out your requirement to take the time to go verbally or in writing direct somebody to go do something. They know that what you need to be done because you built that relationship inside of your teams. And you trust them to go do it using that implicit communication. All right, so this is what you want to do on your side, is using that trust and that Fingerspitzengefühl, build that cohesion to execute that style, that new conception of war he talks about. And then as you build this on yourself, you want to undercut that in your adversary, right? He talks about using multiple thrusts and mismatches, some real, some false, attacking the mental and moral bonds that let your adversary work together. This creates, where you are coherent, this creates discord in your enemy, right? Where you have trust, your adversary now distrusts what their adjacent units are doing. They mistrust the information that they're getting fed because they're starting to suspect that maybe their perceptions don't match reality. And this imposes paralysis and collapse on the will to resist of your adversary. So patterns of conflict is essentially looking through history and describing how militaries have used that successfully on their side and then impose that on their adversaries to undercut it on the other. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so looking at a third element in fighting outnumbered and winning, we're going to shift over to Boyd's presentation, Organic Design for Command and Control, where he really focuses on how to build effective orientation, that second O in the OODA loop. which is functionally the engine in the OODA loop that allows you to update your perception of reality, looking through different lenses and different filters, using your finger spitching fuel and trust. And this presentation talks about how does this translate into a command and control system for your team. He notes in the beginning of this that a common view of command and control in the modern, arguably in the modern American military and other militaries as well, is we tend to be very technology heavy and top down in our view of command and control. He actually starts this presentation by noting a couple of very large C2 exercises from the 70s and 80s that had serious shortfalls, and like the more they levered technology onto these things, the worse they went, which sort of seems counterintuitive. But he notes that the response each time, what the institution tried to change, was not the right thing. Quote, he said that they looked at it, it's all a hardware mentality. Just pile in more hardware, make it more sophisticated, more channels, spend more money, and we're home free, right? And this is in the late 80s, but it kind of sounds a little bit familiar, probably to you in the audience today, of, technology, more information, more ones and zeros will solve all of our problems. Well, 40 years ago, Boyd was noting that's not the case, and that's not how you design a good human command and control system put on humans, not on hardware. So he kind of takes the definitions of command and control, and he looks at them in slightly different, more human terms, not in technological terms. So he acknowledges that what is command, right? Command is the direction and the shaping of what it is that needs to be done. This still comes from the top down, right? This is the commander's responsibility to articulate what they want done on the battlefield. But control is assessing how that direction works in order to modify it and shape it based on changing reality. But this comes from the bottom up. That changing reality is all of those feedback loops, those inputs from those units that are actually out there carrying out the mission, going back to the commander to inject that new information to the commander's OODA loop so that the commander and the staff can start using their own orientation to adjust and adapt. And so it's both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And so he uses different terms because he wants to sort of change the perspective of the audience and how they think about command and control, to talk about leadership and appreciation as opposed to command and control. Leadership is still the top-down part. It is the clear direction of what needs to be done. It is the injecting of action into the system to cause an effect in the system. But then appreciation is that bottom-up, and it's appreciation, you should appreciate what your subordinates do, right? Like you should tell them when they're doing things right, because that will encourage them to continue doing things and taking initiative. But it's appreciation in sort of a different sense of the word, of looking, absorbing, and then from the edges, redirecting and reshaping that next set of actions rather than micromanaging and injecting from the top down without accepting any of that bottom-up feedback that you're going to need to make those decisions. And so he calls this a C2 approach that's based on, quote, the many-sided implicit cross-referencing of orientation, which he mentions regularly in his presentations. And his point is to sort of take like the mechanical, technological approach to C2 out of it and look, because computers don't lead and computers don't appreciate, right? Humans lead and humans appreciate, and that's why he's trying to change that perspective in the terms on how you articulate direction down and how you pull information from bottom up to make new decisions. All right, next slide. Okay, so a fourth element that Boyd we can bring out here in fighting outnumbered and winning. We're going to zoom out from the lower or more tactical levels and look at how this applies to the strategic level, which is what his third presentation, the strategic game of question mark, and I'll get to what those are in a second. This is how do we apply this in the terms of grand strategy, and this steps outside of conflict into the realms in between conflict, right? Into the realms of competition. And I want to spend some time on this because for a couple reasons. One is that some or many of you in this room may someday be in more senior strategic leadership positions where you're not thinking tactically anymore. You need to think about the larger picture and the things that happen outside of the brief periods of violence that are called warfare, right? Like, we're all sitting here, we're not currently at war. This is the bulk of how we're going to spend our time, right? And God willing, we want to minimize the violence and maximize the time where we are deterring or preventing violence from having to happen. But so you may be in those positions where you got to think about what you're doing in those periods in between the violent periods of warfare. And the second thing to think about is, I'm going to take that back just a little bit and say, if you've ever heard of General Charles Krulak, he was a Marine Corps commandant back in the late 90s, but he talked about the concept of the strategic corporal, right? And this is essentially, we're going to go back down to those tactical actions where this is where many of you are still going to operate. Those tactical actions as the platoon commander, platoon sergeant, section leader, fire team leader, or even individual rifleman, your tactical choices can have outsized strategic impacts on the battlefield. You can have national or global level effects by your individual choices or those of your 4 or your 12 or your 30, what have you, soldiers to the left and the right. And this is especially important in the information-saturated battlefield that we live in today. We saw at Abu Ghraib how the poor choices of a handful of Americans severely undercut our strategic goal of stabilizing Iraq and undercut the message that we were there to help and not harm. And that was over 20 years ago, before every single person, I'm confident everybody in this room has at least one personal electronic device on them. I have like 3. I've got my Apple smartwatch, I've got my phone, and I've got my iPad in my bag. I am a walking, talking sensor, and so are all of you. And you can take those sensors and pass information, good or bad information, at the speed of 4K and 5G all the way around the world in the time it takes you to make that seemingly tactical level decision. Your tactical decision can be beamed to all the corners of the planet. So you need to be able to think strategically now, because your tactical actions are going to be under a microscope because of the information-saturated battlefield that we live on now. And so this is what the strategic game kind of talks about. It talks about grand strategy and how, and I talked about how most of the time we spend our time sort of in that strategic space, right? We're not on a battlefield right now. We're not currently at war right now, but we are in a period of pretty intense competition with people who do not have our own interests at heart, people who don't share our goals, people who don't share our values. I know Colonel Edwards talked about China, especially in the UAS space. They've kind of simply by operating in that space, they are able to share and gather information in a way that's very disadvantageous to us. But they're not the only ones out there who are acting contrary to our own interests. We talked about the cartels. You talked about Russia, and talked about some other actors that are out there. So Boyd's point in this is that you still need to be thinking strategically in between those periods of violence. And we still want to take those things we talked about in destruction and creation, patterns of conflict, and the organic design for command and control, and now think about them in those spaces of competition as opposed to conflict. So what are those things that he talks about in warfare that we still want to do in competition? Well, we still want to isolate, degrade, and disrupt our opponent or our competitor. We want to keep them from leveraging the assets and the centers of power around the world to their advantage. We want to close off their system by closing off their access to those sources of strength. And we can do this across a number of different planes. And I know these are touched on in the maneuver warfare placemat that you all have here in this unit, the physical, mental, and moral levels. So thinking strategically, how do we physically isolate our adversary? Well, we can look at countering their narratives by competing narratives of our own, and cutting off and countering their narratives using diplomatic, informational, or other means so that our message gets out to overwhelm theirs. Mentally, we want to isolate them the same way we would on the battlefield, with ambiguous, deceptive, or novel situations, as well as operating at a tempo that appears ambiguous and unpredictable to them. So I think an example of this strategic ambiguity, it has been the policy towards Taiwan that the U.S. has had for many decades now, and it's a deliberate policy of strategic ambiguity. We haven't said that we're definitely going to come to aid Taiwan should they be invaded, but boy, we sure messaged a lot of contingency plans that might happen should China decide to take that action. So whether, crossing different administrations and timeframes, whether we're more sort of strongly into yes, we will, or maybe we won't, the point is they don't know. And they have to include that uncertainty into their decision-making calculus as a potential deterrent factor of, well, if I'm 90% sure that they're not going to intervene, am I really still going to risk that 10%? Because that 10% could still really cause me a bad day. Maybe I need to wait, or maybe not do it. And then looking at the moral level, Boyd talks about this across all of his different presentations about using, highlighting contrast of values or goals, contrasting ours to our adversaries, or highlighting how our adversary fails to live up to their own values. Boyd talked about Vietnam as an example in this because that was very prevalent in the minds of his audience in the late 80s. But he talked about how, man, the North Vietnamese were really good at highlighting disparity between our message of being there to help and the things we actually did on the battlefield, right? Like we said we're there to help, and then we roll tanks through people's villages and destroy the village in order to save it. And the North Vietnamese are like, they say they're here to help, right? Does this look like help to all of you out there? Now, were the North Vietnamese hypocrites about this? Yes, absolutely. But they were much better at pointing out the disparity between our message and what was actually happening on the ground, and using their own propaganda to mitigate, we were less good at pointing out their own hypocrisy because they definitely went into villages and murdered people who didn't cooperate or who they thought collaborated, but they won the messaging campaign at the end of the day. So what does this look like today, right? How can we apply this moral contrast? So again, looking at China as our pacing threat adversary, right? The Chinese, they talk about how the US-led global order is exploitative, how it's abusive, how other countries should shift away from us and join them. And then what do, right? They take their so-called Coast Guard ships and they go ahead and ram Filipino fishing vessels, or they blast them with water cannons, or they interdict resupply efforts to Philippine outposts on Filipino territory. Or you might have seen some of those videos of the massive Chinese fishing fleets that are anchored off of South American shores, like strip mining the fishing beds that those countries depend upon, right? Like that is a golden nugget of hypocrisy between their message of our view of the world is better and who's actually out there exploiting who, right? When it comes down to it. Okay, so that's kind of using the strategic corporal in reverse is what he's getting at here. Next slide. Okay. But taking Boyd's discussion of grand strategy, how to isolate an opponent on a large scale, and during periods of competition and not just open warfare, I'm going to take a slightly different angle here and point out that Boyd has one last point on fighting outnumbered that I want to offer as something to think about. Next slide. If you don't have to, don't. What do I mean by that? In the strategic game and in patterns of conflict, Boyd talks about this over and over again. If you are outnumbered, if you're at a disadvantage when it comes to manpower or material, yes, you want to present your opponent with ambiguous, chaotic, deteriorating situations. You want to hit them from multiple angles and in multiple domains. You want your tempo and your freedom of action to exceed theirs. You want all the possible advantages you can get over your adversary, especially if you are, like I said, at a disparity in numbers and materiel. But it's hard to sustain those advantages, that tempo, to impose that chaotic situation on your adversary in the long run, and especially to remain ambiguous if you are only drawing on your own devices, right? You've built up a repertoire of options and patterns for your own people, but if you're the only ones out there operating on the battlefield, eventually you're going to run through all of your patterns, and now you're going to become predictable to your opponent if you're the only ones out there. So how do you stop that from happening, right? How do you, over the long term, continue to be able to press those advantages against your opponent? Next slide. This goes back to his very top level look at national strategy and achieving national goals, which is get other people to join you and actively contribute to your survival because your survival matches their own interests. I want to point out to that top note there, this is a slide from Patterns of Conflict, that this national goal echoes what Boyd talks about as the fundamental thing we wake up as human beings to do every morning, right? We want to survive and survive on our own terms, right? That's what our nation wants to do. We want to survive and thrive and do the things that we want to do and not have things dictated to us by other countries or our adversaries. And surviving on your own terms has a better chance of lasting in the strategic term, in the long term, if you're not fighting everyone around you, if instead you're developing a network of centers of power that support your own and which share your long-term survival goals and which can also act in your interest in those places, maybe outside of your direct influence overseas, that you might not be able to have a permanent presence or direct intervention, but you want somebody acting on your behalf or at least aligning with your values over in those places because that's good for you in the long run. Let's see. So what does this mean about doing all these things to your adversary and bringing all your friends along to do it? All right, we can look at this at a bunch of different levels, right? We can talk about the power of combined arms, right? You don't want to go out there with just a rifle platoon or rifle company. You want to bring all of your combined arms friends with you. You want indirect fires, you want drones, you want aviation, you want space, you want cyber. You want all those parts of the combined arms to help you, to present more patterns, more uncertainty that your opponent has to grapple with. Let's level this up looking outside of just the National Guard or the Army across a joint force. Hey, what's better than having just Army combined arms? It's having Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Space Force tools and assets alongside of yours so that you can take all of those tools and smash your opponent in the face with those tools as well, because that's now a whole bunch of new dilemmas that your opponent has to deal with. Let's go further up a little bit. When we fight, typically, we're fighting somewhere else, right? We're almost always fighting an away game. But it's somebody's home field. For us, it's almost always an away game. But the people who live there have additional tools that we may not necessarily have that we may want to leverage to go after our adversaries, to impose additional dilemmas on them, right? Whether that's regional logistics support, local knowledge and intelligence, or contributing their own armed forces alongside ours so we're not the only ones who are spilling blood out there on the battlefield. Right? I know Colonel Broyles pointed out some of our Canadian allies are here today, right? I know that, on battlefields in the past, up to and including Afghanistan, the Canadians were out there with us, bleeding at our sides, and you knew the Canadians were there because when you rolled through Kandahar, what did you see? You saw a hockey rink and you saw Tim Hortons, right? That's how you knew the Canadians were there, and they were out there in the battle space fighting and dying alongside of us, right? They shared the burden. They were there. Their interests were aligned with ours. They came to help and to impose additional problems on the adversary that we were fighting together. So again, that's more tools in our hands to smash against our opponents' faces, to cause them dilemmas, right? To hit them from multiple directions, multiple domains, knock them on their asses, and keep them there. And I'm going to leave you with one final analogy to sum this all up. Please indulge me. This gets into a little more of my nerd side. Next slide. All right, so I'm sure many of you have seen Avengers Endgame, one of my favorite movies from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I remember the first time I watched that final huge battle at the very end. This is how my brain works because I'm a giant nerd and because I've been living and breathing Boyd for about 10 years now. So this is just where my mind goes, right? It's just how I am. If you want to talk more about it, like I said, go find me on LinkedIn and we can talk about how my brain works. But love this battle, great action sequence, but the thing that popped into my mind when I saw this was this moment where the tables get turned on Thanos, and I thought, this is exactly what Boyd was talking about getting people on your side so that you're not trying to fight the whole war on your own. So if you recall, right before this moment here, Captain America is doing all of those things Boyd talked about when you're outmatched. Right? You want to impose surprise and the unexpected on your opponent. Well, first of all, Thanos didn't know that Captain America had super soldier serum coursing through his veins. So you remember from Avengers Infinity War, the first time Thanos rolls in to drop a punch, Cap kind of blocks it, and Thanos is like, oh shit, didn't expect that. Man, this I need to recalibrate here because that was unexpected. So now we get to Endgame, right? Wow, Captain America can use Thor's hammer too. That's a surprise, a little curveball Thanos didn't see coming. So Cap keeps layering on the surprise and the shock. He drops the lightning bolt on Thanos, right? He takes his shield, smacks him in the head. He takes the hammer and the shield and uses those to, 1-2 punches to constantly keep Thanos, to keep the tempo to his advantage, keep Thanos off balance over and over again. But that only buys Captain America a little bit of time. Eventually, Thanos figures out those patterns and Once Thanos works out those patterns, he starts beating Cap down, right? Because Cap has used all the tools in his repertoire. Now, Captain America could keep trying fighting on his own, and this picture right here, that little figure right near the sunset, Cap is going to fight the whole damn, legions of Thanos if he has to, because he's Captain America, and that's just how he is, right? But then what happens? Next slide. What happens is the other part of Boyd's point, you bring in your friends, your joint force and allies and partners, and now you can impose surprise and shock and chaos in vastly more ways than you can alone. You want to keep your enemy on the horns of a dilemma? Bring in all of your friends with more horns that you can use to impale your opponent. Next slide. All right? And that's what I love about Cap's expression in this moment. After all, everybody's coming through the portals, right? Like, he now sees that the tables have just been turned, and Thanos has now got a whole bunch of more problems that he's got to deal with. Thanos thought he won. Now it's an entirely new fight because all of these new things are pouring onto the battlefield that Thanos did not expect. And this expression here, again, this is how my brain works, right? Because I'm a giant nerd, Boyd nerd, maneuver warfare nerd. There's that initial look of relief, because yes, it's great. I don't have to fight Thanos, probably die on my own. But then that look changes, right? As more of them come onto the battlefield, the look changes, and as he's turning back and looking at Thanos in this moment, it is with the knowledge that by having all of those other groups on his side, his choices for imposing pain on his enemy just grew exponentially. Now he's got more avenues of attack, more domains he can operate in, more arms for the combined arms fight, and that look on Cap's face says, I don't have to fight alone. My friends, my allies are here too, and with our capabilities together, we are going to beat the shit out of you. All right, next slide, and that's it. All right.